Hello there, folks. I'm Bree Royce, the editor-in-chief of Massively Overpowered. Welcome to another video edition of my long-running MMORPG column, Working as Intended. Today's video is a special one for me as I'm recording it on the 12th birthday of Guild Wars, and that's classic Guild Wars, mind you, not the very popular sequel, Guild Wars 2. So first, let me give you a little history on the game for those of you who want to walk down memory lane, or maybe have never played this at all and are really interested to hear about the game and why I think it's so important even now in 2017. So Guild Wars 1 came out in 2005, which was only a few months after World of Warcraft, and far from bombing because of World of Warcraft, it actually did really well for itself over the course of the next many years, even through the Wrath period. That was sort of what I would consider the golden age of MMORPG creativity, because there were so many different games going off in wildly different directions, and that's why they were able to compete and hold their own against something like WoW. And Guild Wars 1 really did that. It was so different from all the other games around it that it got a lot of attention. And part of that was because it wasn't really an MMORPG to begin with. A lot of people might say it's an MMORPG now, and certainly Wikipedia does, but it wasn't marketed that way. In fact, before launch, this is going to sound weird, it was actually marketed as a sort of online take on a card game like Magic the Gathering, which was, in retrospect, kind of strange because we have actual card games now. But at the time, the layout of skills, the selection of skills that you would take into each instance was considered a really odd thing. Most games did not do that at the time, so it had that in common with the card games. But the real thing that made it not an MMORPG was the fact that you could only take 8 people into any of the open world zones because they weren't really open world zones. They were your own private instance. So it was basically possible to hang out in the hubs where there were lots of other people hanging around doing the sorts of things you do in any MMORPG city. The missions and the quests were conducted in kind of what was just a small instance for just you and your party members. And that party could range from, like, I think it was 2 members at the bottom all the way up to 16 for some of the late game raids. But most of the time it was 8 people. And that was really unusual at that time. We were used to 20-member groups or 80-member raids, so that was quite out of the ordinary. Also out of the ordinary was the whole business model for the game. Instead of just buying the box and then paying for a subscription, you could actually buy the campaign as a buy-to-play game. That was actually one of the first examples of buy-to-play in the MMO industry. And when you purchased future campaigns, you didn't actually necessarily have to have the pre-existing campaigns. They made one expansion very late on that I'll talk about later in the video, but the first 3 games were actually just campaigns. They were all standalone or combined together if you wanted them to be. But personally, what I think sets the game apart most of all is the incorporation of very specific sandbox elements. And what I mean by that is that there was a flat leveling curve throughout the game and a hard cap on the equipment and weaponry and armor in the game, so that there really wasn't a whole lot of power creep that you get in a lot of other games. So normally when you would roll a character in Prophecies, it would probably only take you a week to get to the level cap. The level cap was 20. The level cap was always 20. Just like in Guild Wars 2, there is a hard cap and it is not increasing, not ever. The goal of the game was not really to get to level 20. That was easy. That was trivial. The goal of the game was to play beyond level 20, to expand your character, to collect more gear, and above all else, to collect more skills. In fact, Guild Wars 1 was one of the first MMOs to disentangle the concept of gear and levels and PvP, which means you could actually make, at level 1, having no investment in the game whatsoever, you could create a max level PvP character and use some of the baseline stuff and jump right into competitive play. That was something they were doing in 2005, which is just amazing. But the important takeaway is that the game was really not about endgame. It was not about raiding, even though there were some raids. It was not really about collecting gear, although you could do that. It wasn't about getting better raid gear than everybody else. It was about a churning mid-game, an eternal mid-game where everybody was constantly incrementally increasing in power by collecting more skills, by later on collecting more heroes, and getting better weapon skins and armor skins, which is, yes, and a lot of people call it fashion wars, and I think that's fair because that was definitely one of the draws of the game for me and for a lot of other people. That said, I did have kind of a rough start with the game. My guildies and I did play early on, but we found the original game, as launched as Prophecies, overly difficult. It was very pug-centric. It was just really rough. The AI was just not there yet. Personally, I think ArenaNet took maybe a year and a half more to really roll out more campaigns and roll out more systems like Heroes before I really think it took off. And then it just took root in my soul. I really did play this game as one of my core games almost right up until the day Guild Wars 2 launched. So let's talk about Guild Wars 2 a little bit. It is the elephant in the room. We first found out about Guild Wars 2 right around the time ArenaNet was supposed to be working on the expansion, or rather the campaign, that was going to follow Nightfall. Come to find out, it was probably going to be called Utopia. And if you dig around on massivelyop.com and search for Utopia, you will find Justin's amazing Game Archaeologist article on what was to be, what was supposed to be in Utopia based on, things that the devs said and, images that we got, concept art, that sort of thing. Along the way, the Guild Wars staff basically decided that instead of continue down the campaign paradigm that it had, it was going to make Guild Wars 2 instead. So it basically took what it was working on in Utopia and turned it into Eye of the North, which was actually an expansion, not a campaign. And then a few years after that, of course, we got Guild Wars 2. You're probably expecting me to say something like the biggest difference between Guild Wars 1 and Guild Wars 2 is the fact that Guild Wars 2 is a real MMORPG. And you know what, you're right, it does have an open world feel that was simply not present in Guild Wars 1. But personally, I think what actually sets it apart the most is Heroes. Pretty early on in Guild Wars 1's career, ArenaNet added henchmen. Now, henchmen were basically like default generic NPCs who hung around in town all the time, and you could just use one or two to fill out your party whenever you needed. I don't remember when they changed that, but eventually you could bring 7 of them along with your own character. The thing was, the AI was so bad in the beginning, there's a reason Guild Wars 1 players just kind of facepalm whenever they talk about Orion, because the spells would go off at the wrong time, they would constantly get themselves killed, they would run around, they would get hung up on stuff. They were not really very good, but they were so much better than not being able to play at all. And when pugs were really hard to come by, they were really awesome to fill out your group. And you could kind of slop your way through the game using them. I had a really hard time early on, but I remember completing factions before Heroes with just me solo and my dudes, with the exception of the very last mission. So I know it was possible because I am not an Uber player. And when Nightfall rolled around, ArenaNet honed the henchman system by creating the Heroes system. So the Heroes were sort of like henchmen, only you picked them up as they kind of joined your personal party as you went through the Nightfall storyline, and later on you got some in Eye of the North too. You could equip them with whatever skills you wanted based on their class, and you could also give them gear and that sort of thing. So they were sort of like your own personal party members, only they were NPCs, and it really changed the dynamic of the game. This is really different from the vast majority of MMORPGs who they might give you a pet or two like Star Wars Tor, but at the time that was just really not done out of relatively obscure games like Sword of the New World. You just didn't play parties with NPCs. That's just not how you did it. This game allowed that, and the really cool thing is that it allowed for not just soloing, but really challenging soloing. Because not only did you have to control your own character, but you had to control all of these other characters as well, not just equip them, but control them in battle, or at least set them up with a certain AI selection so that they know what they're doing, and know all of their skill sets to understand what to even give them in the first place. It was really cool and unique, and honestly, it's one of the things that keeps this game playable even now in 2017 when there aren't a whole lot of people playing at all. Obviously, another big difference between the two games is that while they're both buy-to-play, or Guild Wars 2 kind of is still buy-to-play now, Guild Wars 2 isn't running a campaign model. It's only had one expansion to date, although we know that they are working on a second one. Its cash shop is like really in your face. Guild Wars 1 had a cash shop, and you could buy things like skill packs for your PvP characters, you could buy costumes, you could buy storage, but it wasn't anything like the Guild Wars 2 one where that's like almost like a focal point of the game and you can buy gold and that sort of thing. You could not buy gold back in the day. That was just not a thing that studios did, whereas now it's totally commonplace and everybody's doing it that way. And of course, instead of selling as campaigns, ArenaNet is now using in Guild Wars 2 the living world model to kind of deliver updated content as we go, which, you know, it's pretty different from the old school. The mission system is pretty different. The questing system is very different. There were no hearts or anything like that. There were quests in the open world, but mostly you were sort of guided through the storyline with like anchoring missions that kind of marked your progress as you went. And for the most part, you were kind of gated to areas before those missions until you had completed the missions. There were workarounds, but not really that important now. I'd also say that ArenaNet learned a lot about how to run an economy in a video game since Guild Wars 1. Guild Wars 1 had a crafting system, but it kind of amounted to salvaging what you picked up in the world and then handing it over to NPCs to craft your gear. You could also, there were some other ways around it, but you weren't personally crafting gear. You could either find it or you could have the NPCs craft it for you. And there was no trading system in the game. Eventually they added what amounts to like a grouping system for trying to trade things, but it was totally different from a modern or even an old school auction hall. There were no vendors, there was nothing like that. Basically, to trade, you either had to stand around in one of the main cities and spam, or you could go to one of the off-site third-party websites where they would actually run auctions. I did this all the time. It was totally legit, totally safe. I sold hundreds of items. It was a thriving, interesting little market off to the side of the game. A lot of fun, but really there was no system in game for handling it, and I think that was one of the spots where Guild Wars 1 was very weak. Now, I know there are some people out there who really miss some of the classes that weren't included in Guild Wars 2 from Guild Wars 1, and I'm right there with you. I mained a Ritualist. In fact, in a lot of the videos you guys are seeing here, I'm playing my Ritualist. She was my main character from Factions onward, and I just love the class. And yes, Guild Wars 1 had a dual classing system even that Guild Wars 2 does not have, but I think overall the differences are fairly minor. Maybe even more than just missing classes. Guild Wars 2 does not have some of the mechanics. Like, there isn't really very much healing going on in Guild Wars 2 outside of some really specific group builds, whereas Guild Wars 1 had monks and ritualists very big on healing. Really, you just didn't go anywhere without a monk. It just wasn't done. You'd be nuts to try to pull that off because the defensive type healing was such an important thing, really, for quite a number of games in that period, but especially for Guild Wars 1. Guild Wars 2, on the other hand, totally embraced the auction hall, totally embraced crafting as like a skill set that you could have. So really, it's gone much more into the MMORPG side of things since the days of Guild Wars 1. I think I'd also be remiss if I didn't point out that Guild Wars 2 still doesn't have Cantha. I know we're probably going to get the Crystal Desert with the new expansion that's coming, at least if you believe some of the rumors floating around. But we still don't have Cantha, and I want to give a little plug here to Guild Wars 1 for being so far ahead of its time when it comes to incorporating lots and lots of different cultures into the game. Even starting all the way back with prophecies, they've done a really good job of making each biome distinct, all the different kinds of racial makeups of the characters. They're just all over the map, and by the time you go through Factions and Nightfall and Eye of the North, you're dealing with characters who are, you know, they're clearly inspired by South American architecture all the way to China and Korea to East Europe, the Gothic stuff and the Kurzic stuff in Factions, and even the Greek Islanders in the Luxons. It's just all over the map, and it's just so much fun. It's so wonderful, and I really love that. So yes, where's Canada? Oh, okay, I'll lay off of them. The truth is, like a lot of you guys, I love both Guild Wars 1 and Guild Wars 2. But Guild Wars 1 is always going to have a place in my heart for just being remarkable for its day. It stood up to WoW. It stood its own. It's still alive, and it's to ArenaNet's credit that it's still in maintenance mode. You can still play this game today. You can deck out your account. You can get your own heroes. You can even apply some of what you do in this game to Guild Wars 2, which was also pretty revolutionary when it happened. The downside, of course, is that there's not a whole lot of future in it. You probably just need to like the game a whole lot, or really just want to experience the story in order. I don't think there are a whole lot of people playing. As I was taking all of this video over the past week, I really only saw a couple of people hanging out in the outposts, and that's just, I think it's a true tragedy because this really is one of the greats in the genre. but it's just been supplanted by a sequel, and I guess it just demonstrates the danger of actually coming up with, a game that's set in the same world and appeals to the same player base. It just kind of sucked all of the life out of this one. And yes, Guild Wars 1 had problems. If I never hear the words faction grind ever again, I will be so very pleased. But the truth is, every time I come back to this, even when I came back to film this video for the birthday, for the anniversary, I just wanted to play. It's just absolutely compelling. I strongly recommend that everybody give it a try. At this point, it's really cheap and you owe it to yourself. That's it for me. For Massively OP, I'm Bree Royce. If you guys like this kind of video, let us know on the side or down in the comments. Maybe give us a thumbs up and subscribe to us here on YouTube. And don't forget that you can always read more MMORPG news back home on the blog. That's massivelyop.com. We're Massively OP on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and Patreon as well, and Massively Overpowered on Twitch. I'm Brianna on Twitter. And if you really love us, you can become a patron on Patreon to help us keep producing content just like this for all the MMOs you love. Thanks for watching, everyone, and happy birthday, Tyria. Excelsior!